All right, let's dive into a really fascinating and honestly often overlooked chapter in India's freedom struggle. We're talking about the Royal Indian Navy Mutiny of 1946. This is a powerful story, one about courage, a bit of betrayal, and an event that literally shook the very foundations of the British Empire.
So you have to ask yourself, right? How does a hunger strike, a simple protest by some of the most junior sailors, bring one of the most powerful navies in the world to a grinding halt? It sounds incredible, but it happened. Let's get into how it all went down.
So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at the state of the Navy itself. What was going on behind the scenes. Then we'll dig into the grievances that were piling up. After that, we'll see how the rebellion exploded, what happened when they reached out to political leaders, and finally, how it all ended.
Okay, so to really get a grip on this mutiny, we've got to rewind a little and look at the Royal Indian Navy, or the RIN, right after World War II. Because the situation there, well, it was a mess just waiting for a match to be lit.
Before the war, the RIN was barely a navy at all. They called it a skeleton service. Just think about this for a second. British India had this enormous coastline, way longer than its land border. But who was guarding it? Britain's own Royal Navy. And they were charging a hefty fee for it, too. The Indian Navy itself was tiny.
And then, boom, World War II kicks off and everything changes. The British needed people, and they needed them yesterday. So recruitment into the RAN just exploded. We're talking about a jump from just 1,200 people in 1939 to over 30,000 by 1944. That is a massive, incredibly rapid expansion. Yeah, a 25 times increase in just 5 years. But here's the crucial part. This growth wasn't happening in the officer ranks. Nope, it was almost all at the very bottom, in these junior ranks called ratings. And as their numbers swelled, the facilities, the accommodation, the support, none of it kept up. And that created a huge, huge problem.
So, you've got this massive, hastily thrown together force of young men, all crammed into really poor facilities. What do you get? You get a tinderbox of grievances, just waiting for a spark. Let's take a closer look at the specific things that led to this uprising.
For a naval rating, daily life was just one hardship after another. The food was terrible, the places they lived were third class, racial discrimination was absolutely everywhere, the officers were pretty much all white, and the ratings had to put up with constant verbal abuse. And forget about getting a promotion or equal pay. On top of all that, they were getting sent on these really unpopular missions, like to Indonesia, to put down other independence movements.
So by the end of 1945, things were really at a boiling point. In November, on the ship HMS Talwar, ratings actually sabotaged the Navy Day preparations. At the same time, news about the Red Fort trials of the Indian National Army soldiers was spreading, and that was firing up nationalist feelings all over the country. And then, the final straw came on February 18, 1946, on that very same ship, when the ratings started a hunger strike over the awful food. And that hunger strike, that was the spark that lit the whole tinderbox. It went from a simple protest to a full-blown rebellion that just spread like wildfire from ship to ship.
Now, the key to their success was unity. The ratings knew they needed a simple, powerful slogan that every single person could get behind. They were actually inspired by Gandhi's Salt March. You know, how he took an everyday thing, salt, and made it a symbol. Well, the ratings chose food. Their slogan was no food, no work. It was direct, it was universal, and it was incredibly effective.
And the message just took off. Pretty soon, the strike involved over 78 ships and 20 bases on shore. And this part is so telling. It shows this was way more than just a protest about bad food. The ratings started tearing down the British flags and putting up the flags of the Congress, the Muslim League, and the Communist Party. They were signaling their loyalty to the Indian freedom struggle. And this wasn't just chaos either. They got organized. The ratings elected a formal group to lead them, the Naval Central Strike Committee, or NCSC. It was led by President M.S. Khan and Vice President Maidan Singh. This gave them a unified voice, a clear leadership, and a way to present their demands properly. So the mutiny was going incredibly well. It was organized, the ratings had control of the ships, they had all this momentum. But now they needed political leadership. They needed someone to help them connect their fight to the bigger national movement. So they reached out to the country's top leaders. But the answer they got back was definitely not what they were expecting.
The difference here is just, wow. The ratings were appealing to leaders like Sardar Patel and Mohammad Ali Jinnah, seeing themselves as soldiers for independence. But the leaders, well, they were deep in negotiations for a peaceful transfer of power. And from their perspective, an armed mutiny was just an undisciplined mess that can screw everything up. They told the ratings to surrender, immediately. The only thing they offered was a vague promise to try and make sure they weren't punished too harshly. And that political rejection, well, it was a fatal blow. Without any backing from the national leadership, the ratings were suddenly all alone. So let's look at how this historic mutiny finally came to an end. At this point, you could see the writing on the wall. First, they were politically isolated. No one had their back. Second, the British government, seeing that they didn't have to worry about a political firestorm, moved in with force. They surrounded the ships and bases with army troops. With no political cover and being completely outgunned, the NCSC had no other real option. They had to advise surrender. And on February 23, 1946, it was all over. In the end, the ratings were caught between a rock and a hard place. On one side, you had the full military might of the British Empire, and on the other, a wall of silence from the very leaders they were fighting for. They were trapped. So, looking back, it's pretty easy to just write this off as a failure, right? The ratings surrendered, a lot of them were punished, but that is totally missing the bigger picture. So why does this seemingly failed protest matter so much in the story of India's independence?
Because of this, a lot of historians argue that the Rin Mutiny was the final nail in the coffin of the British Raj. And why is that? Because it proved to the British that they could no longer count on the loyalty of the Indian armed forces, which was the absolute bedrock of their control over India. And that really brings us to the final question to think about. The Quit India movement had already shaken up the civil administration. The INA trials showed that the public was on the side of armed resistance. But when the Navy itself, the very people meant to defend the empire, turned against the crown, was this the final undeniable proof for the British that the game was up, that they just couldn't hold India by force anymore? Something to definitely think about. Thanks for tuning in.